Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar, which is organized by the EEAC, the European Environmental and Sustainability Advisory Council through Europe. My name is Jan Verheke. I'm Secretary General of the Flemish Environmental Advisory Council and Vice Chair of the EEAC. And welcome to you all, I want to say. Now, the topic of today is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which has been launched last year in February by the European Commission. It's an interesting topic. The proof is that we have 150 participants on this session. It's not only an interesting topic, it's a topic that will have, if it ends well, important consequences. It's about due diligence, not only in the form of reporting, but also in the form of real measures that companies have to take. There will be a form of planning, there will be liabilities, there will be a role for government, there will be guidance, and there is also a web of coherent measures of different types that are in relation to this directive. So we have invited 4 important speakers that can introduce the topic very well to our audience. The 4 speakers are Mr. Dan Dionisi of the European Commission. He will introduce us to the topic. Then we have Ms. Anaïs Berthier, who is from Client Earth. Then we will have Günther Tallinger, who is not only from the Allianz Group, but also from the UN High-Level Expert Group on Net Zero Emissions for non-state actors. And then at the end, we will have Frederik Hans, who is also from New Climate Institute. All 4, they will give their introduction in 10 minutes time. It's an incremental session, so who comes after another can give short comments on the previous lecture. So incrementally, we will learn more and more, and it will be interactive. And in the end, there will be time for questions and answers. So, dear audience, if you have questions and answers, at the bottom, there's a question and answer button. You can press it, and you can introduce your questions, and we will try and bring them in at the end of the session. So now, I want to give the floor to our first speaker, Mr. Dan Dionisi. He's head of unit company law at the Director General of Justice and Consumers. It's a part of the Commission we don't often meet, so it's very interesting, and we are very pleased to welcome you. And you happen to be in charge of this directive, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to address this audience. So, as you explained, this will be an interactive and incremental session. So I'll start. I'll try to lay out, let's say, the basics in relation to this initiative on corporate sustainability due diligence. I will refer mostly to the Commission proposal made, as you mentioned, in February of last year, because, of course, we are now in the middle of the legislative process here in the EU, with the Council and the Parliament involved. And I would, as you may understand, I would rather refrain from making comments on the co-legislators' positions, because soon we expect we will be engaging in a negotiation process. So I will try to refer mainly to the philosophy and the approach behind the initial proposal made by the Commission, and would of course very much like to hear your feedback and to engage with you on these aspects. So why this proposal, and what is it aimed at? It aims at being a game changer in terms of shifting the economic model that we have in Europe, and not only, towards a more sustainable paradigm. So it's very ambitious, and yeah, in short, it aims at changing the world. How do we go about this? We don't want to ask for impossible things. So it's a key principle in this proposal is proportionality. In particular, for instance, we are targeting companies that have the capacity to induce change, and together they can have the critical mass to trigger more systemic change at the level of the economic system. So directly within the scope of the proposal are the large companies of all the sectors. So to create an all industry impact, while at the same time sparing the smaller companies from the legal duties. Um, so in terms of scope, you may have heard about this. We are actually targeting directly about 1% of the companies in the EU. And you may think this is very little, but actually not. It's part of this proportionality and targeting. These 1% of the companies, together with their value chains, account for about half of the economic turnover. So the impact we expect will be very considerable. In addition, also as part of this proportionality, we have identified a few high-risk sectors that are, let's say, in particular focus, and where the threshold for the companies to be covered is lowered. And these refer to agriculture, textile and footwear, as well as minerals, including extractions. The legal obligations are placed on the large companies, which are best able to leverage more sustainable practices through their value chains. At the same time, we recognize that smaller companies, SMEs, may be indirectly impacted because of being part of these value chains of large companies. And for the SMEs, we paid particular attention to ensuring that they get the necessary technical and financial support to do their part when they have to, and are also protected against abuse from the bigger partners in the value chains. Now, what the proposed directive is about is behavior of the company. So what the companies should do, this due diligence. So in a way, it's an obligation of means more than anything. So what is the behavior that we require from the companies? And this is about addressing adverse impacts on human rights and the environment, both in their own operations and in their value chains, not only in the EU, but also outside the EU. So it's about integrating due diligence into their policies, identifying actual or potential adverse impacts in terms of environment and human rights, preventing and mitigating these adverse impacts, and ending them, repairing the damage, having ways to respond to complaints, and monitoring and the effectiveness of their actions, and also reporting about them. So this is about the due diligence. Directors of the companies will have a duty to implement and supervise the due diligence obligation, including by integrating it into the corporate strategy. And in addition, certain large companies will have to formulate a transition plan to ensure that their business strategy is compatible with the Paris Agreement and limiting the global warming to 1.5%. The proposal builds on the international multilateral conventions on environment and human rights, as well as labor standards. It aims at fostering continuous engagement of the companies with their value chain partners, not at terminating the business relationships. Terminating the business relationships is only a last resort in case no other due diligence measures, and there is a long menu, result in preventing or mitigating the adverse impacts. The rules will be enforced through a combination of administrative sanctions and civil liability. And the Commission is also planning support measures, accompanying measures once the directive is adopted, with information guidelines, leveraging our external action, and so on, to support the implementation. So we want to support companies doing the right thing in a way that is both effective and efficient. Now, I will maybe take just a couple of minutes at the end to refer to how climate change is covered in the proposal. Again, referring to the proposal, because I understand this is also in particular focus for this session. The guiding principles in addressing climate change, as with the overall proposal, have been proportionality and also providing legal certainty. So therefore, with this in mind, the proposal has an approach on climate change that is not exactly the same as the full value chain due diligence. However, there is a review clause in the proposal where we open the door that following an evaluation, the Paris Agreement could also become part of due diligence. So we need further analysis for this. So this review clause stipulates that the Commission will evaluate 5 years after the directive starts to apply whether the rules on due diligence should be extended to climate impacts. Secondly, directors are to implement and supervise the due diligence obligation, including by integrating into the corporate strategy, as I mentioned. And when fulfilling their duty to act in the best interest of the company, they are required to take into account human rights, environment, but also climate change consequences of their decision. Thirdly, both EU and non-EU companies above a certain size, the so-called Tier 1, Group 1 companies, are required to adopt a plan that ensures their business model and strategy are compatible with the transition to a sustainable economy and limiting the global warming to 1.5% in line with the Paris Agreement. And if climate change is identified as a risk, either as a risk for the company or an impact of the company's operations, in that case, they have to include in their plans emission reduction objectives. And additionally, this plan has to be taken into account when setting any variable remuneration component for the directors. This duty to adopt the plan is subject to administrative enforcement. So it's in the proposal, it's not subject to civil liability, but to administrative enforcement regime. And therefore, just in short, we are addressing in the proposal climate change in two ways. These transition plans that are linked to variable remuneration for the directors, and the clarification of directors' duty to act in the best interest of the company in a way that also integrates climate change considerations. Now, the proposal, as I mentioned, is currently with the co-legislators. The Council has already adopted its negotiating position at the end of last year. The Parliament is in the process of doing so, and we expect a final vote in Parliament on 1st of June, after which we will, of course, go through this very specific EU policy-making negotiation process, which is called trilogues. And our expectation is to have the directive adopted by the end of this year. So this is the hope and expectation. And this would mean, considering also the transposition period and the different deadlines for application, we expect it to have concrete effects on the ground in about 3, 4, 5 years time, depending on the different groups of companies. And of course, now as you may have seen, there are different discussions also about the timeline for its implementation. So to conclude, again, a very ambitious proposal, at the same time, very mindful of proportionality and ensuring legal certainty for the companies that are targeted, and also with a clear intention on our side of the Commission to accompany the implementation with supportive measures. So I will stop here and look forward to the exchange with the other panelists and with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Danelisi, for this very clear introduction to this directive and to this operation. This, as you say, very ambitious, at the same time proportionate, and it offers a kind of legal certainty, as you said. This is immediately a nice introduction to the next speaker, who is Ms. Anaïs Berthier, who is head of the Brussels office of Client Earth, an environmental charity promoting the use of law to protect life on Earth. With offices also in London and Warsaw, but we have Ms. Berthier here to give her first reaction on what is at stake. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. Just want to add, we also have offices in London, in Madrid, in Berlin, in Beijing, and in Los Angeles, just to be complete. So, yeah, well, just would like to start with an introduction to say that really the role the private sector must play so that we succeed in carrying out the Union's transition to climate neutral and a green economy in line with the European Green Deal is really key and central. So without the private sector playing its role, we will just fail to actually address the climate and the biodiversity crisis. And so that's why the proposals from the European Commission for a directive on corporate sustainability and due diligence is really an essential component of the success of the European Green Deal. And I agree with what has been said before. It can really be a game changer if it's ambitious enough. And we'll see that it's not the case yet. And so we really need to have a holistic approach at EU level to shape business conduct in order to ensure that business actually do not undermine the EU sustainability goals, but actually instead contribute effectively to achieving them. And so to this end, Article 15 of the Commission's proposal on combating climate change that sets out an obligation for certain companies, only certain companies to adopt a transition plan, is an essential tool to promote company-wide action on climate change. However, to ensure that the goals of the directive's proposal can be actually achieved, two really important changes need to be made. Otherwise, the law will simply not be ambitious enough and will not deliver and will not change the world, as just has been said. So first, the first thing to be done is the obligation to adopt these climate transition plans must actually be embedded within a wider climate due diligence duty. For now, it's not the case. The Commission proposal does not actually, as it's been said, even include the Paris Agreement in the conventions that are listed in the annex to the directive to the definition of what constitutes an adverse environmental impact. So first of all, just want to say that that's incomprehensible. And so the directive proposal only foresees the possibility of including the adverse climate impacts as part of the due diligence requirements 7 years after the entry into force of the directive. And so that's, of course, way too late. This approach directly undermines the Commission's reason to adopt such a proposal, but also the objectives of the proposal to shape business conducts and to ensure that they address their climate contribution. Omitting the Paris Agreement and climate as a whole, so just to say, we won't change the world in not including climate in the directive's proposal, is not only incoherent with other related EU pieces of legislation like CSRD on reporting, but also with existing international due diligence standards. And so business responsibility to respect human rights already actually requires, among other things, that business enterprises activities should be aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So, of course, while the climate transition plans that are foreseen by Article 15 can complement and support the due diligence obligations, having them as the only tool for climate due diligence is not enough and will actually inevitably delay the necessarily significant reductions of greenhouse gas emissions that the private sector must achieve. And so including climate change among the categories of the adverse environmental impacts that have to be addressed by the private sector is really necessary to also actually ensure that climate change contributions are identified, prevented, mitigated, and accounted for. The second main change that should be made if we want the law to be ambitious enough and to be a game changer is actually that Article 15 should include a clear requirement for all companies that fall under the scope of the directive to implement transition plans, but also establish content criteria. So for now, the Commission's proposal really falls short of actually defining the exact content of a plan, of this climate plan. And so the directive really needs to be more prescriptive about the content of the climate plan. It's essential as well to ensure that it can be actually an actionable instrument and not only another commitment to commit, if you will. So there is a skyrocketing number of corporate climate pledges, a wide variation in corporate responses to climate change, but also different methodologies used to set and assess corporate climate commitments. So while these can help, of course, and drive ambition, in the absence of specific and enforceable legal standard, there's a high risk of increased greenwashing and that the plans are purely cosmetic. So if you look at the recent report, for example, by CDP, more than a third of companies disclosing to CDPs in the EU in 2021 reporting having actually already climate transition plan in place, yet only 2% of these European companies that had reported on all the elements that actually make up for a credible climate transition plan in 2021. The report also states that emissions reductions target publicly disclosed by European companies are now aligned with the 2.4 degrees decarbonization pathway instead of the 1.5 degrees. If you look also at the World Benchmarking Alliance Climate and Energy Benchmark, it shows that systemic lack of actions in key economic sectors such as transport, finance, oil, gas, and the automotive sectors just do not take the right action. And companies in these sectors are just falling behind on decarbonization. And most of their emissions targets are just too low. The risk is also illustrated by the French example, being the first country having adopted a legal framework with the French duty of vigilance law. And we see that the lack of specificity on the obligation related to climate has actually led to the French companies' action on climate being largely insufficient still today. Really important as well, the targets, emissions reduction targets are an essential element of the transition plans. They cannot be envisaged without targets. The Commission's proposal is still not clear enough. As it's been said, Article 15 states that only in case climate change is or should have been identified as a principal risk or a principal impact of the company's operation, the company will have to actually adopt targets. It's not enough. All companies should adopt targets. Really important as well, we need to ensure consistency among the different pieces of EU legislation, and in particular with the CSRD. That's the least the EU could do. And so Article 15 should also be more specific and include short, medium, long-term targets, including absolute greenhouse gas emission reduction target, cover the full value chain, including scope 3 emissions, and be based on the best available science in accordance with the IPCC report. And last but not least, to effectively, of course, motivate companies' directors to prioritize sustainability, it's also essential to link a meaningful proportion of their variable remuneration to the sustainability target of the company. But that should apply to all the companies that are subject to the directive. And so just to conclude, I'd like to say that, of course, some stakeholders are concerned about the burden and the costs that actually would be incurred by adapting their value chain. But it's, I think, important to emphasize on the opportunities that the legislation will provide. It will create actually opportunities for business because it will reduce reputational, financial, legal risks. And as it's been said before, I agree, increase legal certainty as well for companies, and avoid as well to actually have to face real resource scarcity and the impact of climate change on their own economic activities, which are really real today. So I think it's important to emphasize on the opportunities that legislation also provides for business. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very clear message. It's a very important critique. You say that the directive in general in Article 15 should, in particular, should have a wider range, should be more articulate in relation to targets, should be more prescriptive, and should be more consistent in the whole. And at the same time, it will be an opportunity because the problems that are underneath are important problems and everybody has to deal with it. Thank you very much. It is very clear and it's a step forward in our insight in this directive. I now give the floor to Mr. Talinger, who is member of the board of Allianz Group, and as I said, also chair of the UN convened Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance and member, I don't dare to say it all, but I read it, of the UN high-level expert group on the net zero emissions commitment of the non-state actors. Very long. It suggests that you are very involved in the topic, and I give you with pleasure the floor.
No, thank you. Thank you indeed. I'm a mathematician, therefore you can't blame me on these super complicated wordings. That's just, let's say, for a start. Indeed, I'm a trained investor, but today I'm allowed to speak in my role in the expert group on net zero commitments. Let me briefly explain on the genesis of that expert group. Many of you may remember Glasgow COP26. There are quite a number of net zero pledges were announced, and even major initiatives were also brought forward. Very good intentions in terms of the high-level communication. However, these communications that were out there made many observers and experts to really think a little bit deeper about it and actually develop concerns in terms of, are these pledges really trustworthy? are they really material? And these concerns were brought to the attention of the UN and even to the Secretary General and his office. And that created then the wish to implement an expert group. And that expert group actually was then launched in March last year with the objective to come up with a report that describes how net zero pledges should be designed and how they should be implemented. And in order to just give you a quick overview, I have one chart that simply contains the 10 points or the 10 agenda points of that report. I don't expect you to read this, this chart now here. It just may help to guide us a little bit. I also understand that the colleagues who organized this call can equip you with a link for this report that was published, obviously, by the UN, also now in multiple languages. I will for sure say mirror what we heard already from the prior speakers, and in particular, the topic around prescriptive description, what a net zero, a climate pledge should really contain. We have heard, for instance, the topic transition plan now multiple times in this session. The report that was produced last year and communicated then in Sharm el-Sheikh contains under chapter 4 a very explicit description what a transition plan actually should look like. Elements like third-party verification, elements like a reference to sector pathways, a clear description how targets are linked with executive remuneration and compensation, or also very important, the clear request that the transition plan details what policies and regulations are needed to facilitate the implementation of this very much the transition plan itself. To just mention a few examples, and I believe as Ms. Padier just mentioned, some of these prescriptive elements could perhaps be good examples for the further development of the due diligence directive. I should go then, let's say, quickly through the other chapters that we have here. The chapter number 10, to start from the back, is actually very much what we do here today in this session. Why? Because the expert group clearly said what should not happen with the report is that it somehow lands in a drawer and then rests there and is never read again. No, actually the report really needs to find its way into regulation. For this reason, we in the expert group are actually very happy that the due diligence directive is a major initiative now within the EU legislative procedures, because this is, of course, the road to regulation. And for this reason, we, of course, hope that the report finds its way. And this is also one of the points where I'm very grateful that I have the chance to present it to you, because then the one or the other of you may have really the opportunity to go through and see what else can really be brought into the discussions around the due diligence directive. Now, really starting from the beginning, the first chapter is obviously about the net zero pledge. So what is actually a net zero pledge? How should it be announced? And very important, there it is clearly mentioned, it needs to be 1.5 degree, and limited overshoot at the maximum. That must be the basis. I should also say that this report is meant to guide and require actually from those who come up with voluntary net zero pledges. However, in the context of the due diligence directive, we do believe that that report with all its content can really be considered also for more than only voluntary. It can really find its way into requirements, regulation type of requirements. The net zero targets, how they need to be set, is the second chapter. I will skip that one. If you have questions, more than happy. Voluntary credits is very important and may also be something that in the context of the due diligence directive can be discussed. Why that? Because the report explicitly says voluntary credits, while they are welcome, they cannot be considered against interim targets. Interim targets, as the report says, should be set for 2025 and then every 5 years. 2025, very important. You may want to think what examples you have in terms of companies or even bigger networks of companies who have set 2025 targets. It could be that you do not know a single example. Still, this is required and examples exist. One of them is, for instance, Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which I'm allowed to chair. Their 2025 targets for emission reduction have to be set for all the members. And it's important perhaps to mention, this is not a small network. It's 85 big investors, in total 11 trillion of assets. So it is possible to go with this type of target setting. It is possible to really follow through on it in a strong form. The due diligence directive clearly states it in that form, which is obviously quite welcome. Transition plan I mentioned already, the phasing out of fossil fuels and then also scaling up the renewable energy is something that is clearly required in the context of a net zero pledge. This is in terms of the regulation in the European Union, and clearly in some other aspects, in some other areas regulated. Obviously, the taxonomy is one example to mention. So I would not state here now that this needs to be also considered with the due diligence directive. However, in a transition plan, which is part of the due diligence directive requirements, it clearly should play a role. Lobbying and advocacy is chapter 6. And obviously the point here is to make transparent what activities are behind the whole net zero pledge, and clearly also step away from any form of lobbying that works against the net zero pledges. This is an aspect, I must say, that we have not seen in regulation already fully required, maybe something to be considered. Just transition, clearly, especially for financial institutions, very important, but not only for financial institutions. And the just transition, as it is described in the report, is not only, let's say, towards the development in still so-called emerging markets. It is also within developed economies, and it is also considering that there need to be a form of taking along all those who are concerned, massively concerned by the transformation of the economy as such. And again, this form of net zero pledge needs to cover it and need to lay it out how a company is really dealing with it. The chapter 8 is very straightforward. How is actually data provided? How is, let's say, a form of accounting assurance, auditing assurance, sorry, given, how is also made use of certain established data platforms. Here we do have a big topic. Why? Because these data platforms do not yet exist. There is the European Single Access Point as one possible, let's say, data platform. There is the Bloomberg, the so-called Bloomberg Macron initiative. UNFCCC is also working on a respective data platform, but this is in the making. And we in the expert group would clearly say such a data platform, such data platforms need to exist to make sure that observers can really follow through over time how a net zero pledge is implemented. Investing in a just transition is more than the just transition as such. It is really requiring how are CapEx structured such that this just transition can really be implemented. And then there's the last point that I mentioned already on the road to regulation, which I said, this is what we are doing here right now. Now, I did talk about climate only. I'm very much aware that the CSDDD is covering much more, but as you mentioned right at the beginning, this is a little bit of a focus topic, so I hope that I could contribute to this discussion, and I'm of course looking forward to any form of questions or interpretations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thallinger. I must point to I thank you very much for this explanation to the report. The report is called, once again, Integrity Matters, Net Zero Commitments by Businesses, Financial Institutions, Cities and Regions. And the link has been shared to you by our online moderator. So normally all participants could access this report. Mr. Thallinger has to leave us at 3 o'clock. If we are in time, we can put some questions to him in time. Otherwise, it will be sent to him and he's prepared to answer them afterwards. I'm looking at questions and answers, and I see that until now, only two, very important, but still only 2 questions have been posed. So I invite the 90 participants to introduce questions so we have a lively debate. That's for that. And now it's the turn to Mr. Friedrich Hans, who is an expert on climate policy and corporate responsibility at the New Climate Institute for Climate Policy and Global Sustainability. It's also based in Cologne, and he's one of the authors of another report, and that report is called Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor. Friedrich, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here today and perhaps structure my 10 minutes interventions in the following way, that we would quickly recap together in 3 or 4 minutes our key findings of the Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor 2023, and then particularly zoom in on the good practice that, based on our really in-depth, rigorous assessments of corporate actors we have done, and to see how those good practice elements could inform the operationalization of Article 15 of the CSDDD. And with that, I would share my screen. I hope you can see it by now. So the Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor has been launched now for a second time. The first iteration was last year, February 2022, and it came exactly, as Günther mentioned, just after 2 months after the COP26 in Glasgow, where we had seen this massive momentum of corporate actors pledging net zero, carbon neutrality, climate neutrality, an entire range of different terminologies. And what we do with these analyses here is that we really look at a subset of multinational companies, big global players, so not just the EU globally, but obviously also European companies. And we really assess the transparency and integrity of their corporate climate responsibility strategies. And this year we looked at 24 companies covering around 4% of global emissions, so very substantial across Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. And what we do when we assess those companies, and each assessment takes around 8 to 10 days, is that we assess basically 4 different dimensions. One is, how do they track and disclose emissions? How do they set specific targets in the short, medium, and long term? How do they set or specify measures and transition plans underpinning those targets? And sort of what kind of offsetting and climate contribution strategies do they pursue? And again, how do we evaluate them in terms of transparency and integrity? And what are the key findings in that regard? The first one is really, and similarly to last year's report, quite blunt, that the existing climate pledges are simply highly insufficient and oftentimes misleading. So when we look at the overall overview across those 24 companies, and this is a bit too small perhaps for you to read, but just to see what is the picture across those 24 companies, we see that by our definition, by our standard, none is in the highest integrity box. We only see one company, Maersk, being in the reasonable integrity box, and then clearly the majority of companies either being evaluated low or even of very low integrity. And I will elaborate in a second a little bit also what that means and why we consider that indeed of low integrity. Speaking of net zero and also what Günther referred to in terms of specifying kind of what good net zero targets look like when speaking of corporate actors, when we check across those 24 companies, all of them have set net zero targets. All of them join one or even multiple of these voluntary initiatives. We see that these net zero pledges only account or amount to a reduction of 36% of emissions across the entire value chain by the target years, and not close to 100 as that terminology sort of would suggest towards consumers or regulators or investors. So there's a really critical mismatch in what is being pledged and then how it is sort of specified and substantiated. And that is perhaps even more distracting when looking at the time frame towards 2030, where we know this is the critical, crucial decade to really implement credible climate action, that those emission reduction components, again, across the entire value chain, are only in the medium 15 to 21%. And that goes way less than half of what is needed by 2030 when we look at latest available science. And even worse is that even those companies that are perhaps closer to the 40–50% reduction, even those companies we would not consider 1.5 degree compatible, because when we look at are these targets in line with what is required for the specific sector, then we see that those companies do not set targets that according to these sector-specific standards. And then perhaps concluding that part on just what are our key findings of the study, and obviously there's way more in the report itself, but just zooming in on transition plans, we also see that the transition plans at the moment, and particularly how they presented towards the public, are insufficient to really drive transformative change. So oftentimes we do not even really understand what are the transition plans, how do companies aim to target the key emission sources across the entire value chain. What are the timelines they want to pursue? What are the specific measures? How far do they go? What is the scope? So all this really sort of limits the potential to drive transformative change. However, and that's perhaps the last point, and also really important always when we speak about the CCM, is that we identify replicable good practice. And this is also really to focus, or important to focus on, when we speak about how can we improve the situation and how can we really set up stringent, enforceable, and powerful regulation in that sense. So what are these good practices that we identify? And perhaps just first to start with one observation, and that's, I think, the outcome of our research. Others might see it differently, but for us, that is really clear when that comes out, is that governments should not just rely on softer approaches by just supporting voluntary initiatives or requiring companies to join voluntary initiatives and consider sort of the job done. In our opinion, and also this is what the sort of results currently show of our analyses, it is really important that governments themselves set mandatory and enforceable regulation to be implemented, because only that puts, in our opinion, sort of the pressure on the companies that indeed these then are 1.5 degree aligned transition plans, and not just perhaps well-intended or good sounding plans and targets, but that lack then substance in that sense to really achieve what we all sort of need to do. So what are the good practices across those 4 dimensions? In terms of time, just to not go too far, I will rush a little bit through those. But obviously then in the report itself, each of those good practice elements that we identified is explained in more detail. And I'm obviously also happy to go into more detail in the question and answer. So first, when it comes to tracking and disclosure of emissions, and I think both Anis and Günther mentioned it also before, it is really important to look at the entire value chain emissions. So companies should disclose on scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and we also argue on non-GHG climate forces, for instance, in the aviation and maritime shipping sector. And that needs to be presented on an annual basis with a detailed breakdown, so to really understand what is the full emission profile of a certain company. Because only then, when we look at targets, and that's the second part, only then we can really understand, or companies can really set meaningful short, medium, and long-term targets covering the entire value chain emissions. And that's just so important to emphasize, because, for instance, what we see towards the 2030 timeframe at the moment is that companies oftentimes set a target perhaps for scope 1 or set a target for scope 2, but then, for instance, leave out scope 3 or leave out really substantial emissions that are not covered by any target. So we say, and that's also what we see in terms of good practice, what also certain corporate actors already do, set these targets in 5-year intervals, independent from offsetting. We would even argue also the long-term targets need to be set independent from offsetting to really focus on emission reductions and put them at the forefront. These targets need to be aligned, and I mentioned it before, with sector-specific 1.5 degree compatible trajectories. So not just also global trajectories, because there are sectors that certainly need to go faster, and then set those targets across all emission scopes. And when we look at the third component, and this is sort of the reducing emissions, the transition plans, we I would also really echo what Annelies said before, some of these elements that she mentioned, that this should mandate really companies to set comprehensive transition plans that, again, are really aligned and informed by what is required in the particular sector to be 1.5 degree compatible. It needs to require detailed information on what are these emission or measures that companies take, addressing basically all emission sources across their value chain. For instance, on what's the timeline for implementation, what's the estimated impact in terms of emission reduction, what is the scope of those measures, in order to really have sort of credibility and integrity behind those plans, to understand that as regulators, as consumers, as investors, on how does that plan look like, and that it can really sort of trigger transformative change. And then also include these elements like scaling up flagship projects to really mainstream those across organizations and sectors and invest in research and development. Perhaps just one side note, that's also something in addition we look at in the CCRM, is how companies should procure renewable electricity, where companies should really sort of be mandated, and also obviously in the first place do it by themselves. And we see some actors doing it already to only pursue the highest quality procurement constructs, recognizing the limitation of renewable energy certificates and some other constructs that really simply do not trigger additional renewable capacity installments, and use accurate and transparent accounting methods. And with that, I come to the last point. That's the climate contribution and offsetting. We as New Climate Institute, also in our analysis, sort of are advocating for an approach that is called climate contributions, where basically companies should price their emissions according to a Paris Agreement compatible carbon price, and then take this money and support climate change mitigation activities beyond their value chain, but without claiming compensation. So do not do any offsetting. So that is our sort of good practice, and we see some actors doing it. If a company still decides to do less transparent offsetting in, for instance, meeting a net zero target by a certain year, that should then be very transparently disclosed in what sort of offset credits schemes they use, to what extent, so what is the overall magnitude of the offsetting that they envision for a particular target in a particular target year, and then also only pursue high quality offset credits. So that's perhaps in a quick rundown, the good practice that can really, in our opinion, help inform regulation to really then have sort of sound, comprehensive and enforceable regulation when we speak about 1.5 degree compatible reduction targets and transition plans that underpin these.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hans. Once again, a very instructive and critical report and message to us all. Once again, the report has been shared and can be downloaded in a message by our moderator. I will now open the Q&A. I see that there are 3 questions. Can you all see the questions, or should I read them? You can see them. But first of all, there is Mr. Talinger, who has to leave us within 5 minutes, and there's no direct question to you. So I give you the floor for a few minutes comments on what you heard from the other participants before leaving. if you want.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much. I would say in terms of the understanding what is really required from companies, we really have quite some alignment here. It is not that there is really a major discrepancy, irrespective of the fact that what was expressed today is really ambitious. Is certainly very ambitious. And I'm not talking about the due diligence directive. I'm talking about what we have heard here today is really indeed ambitious, because there were quite some remarks what on top can be included. As I said before, there are really companies who are willing to face this. They are willing to face this. And these companies, they are looking forward to do an implementation and enactment of the due diligence directive for the very simple reason that this would level the playing field. One of the big topics that those companies have that want to transform and change is that there are other companies who kind of benefit from not transforming. So in the investors' world, a typical example is an investor approaches a company and explains, look, this is the expectation that we have in terms of target setting in the transformation plan. And another investor says, look, not much of expectations. This is how we would finance your endeavors. Mm-hmm. And then you are in a very, very, let's say, disparate situation, because the company may actually like to go with a financing institute organization that is much more easygoing and is really financials only.
Okay, then, Mr. Tellinger, then I have a last question to you. Do you support, or to which degree do you support the application of the CSDD to the financial sector? Because this is also a point of discussion.
Yeah. We would clearly welcome this discussion. As I said, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, and I really ask you to at least, all of you, to at least take a little bit of time and look into what the Asset Owner Alliance has put forward as commitment, as policies, and the like. We look for a level playing field. And the level playing field requires a certain form of minimum regulation. And the expert group, where I was allowed to speak today, clearly, road to regulation, how to speed this up. Absolutely, financial institutions need to be covered.
Okay, and so I see that you have still 1 minute, and a question popped up for you on the Article 15 discussion. Is there enough knowledge and capacity at the supervisory authority to judge about the plans and measures therein?
Yeah, let me give a polite answer. It is really important that we acknowledge that so far we do steer with financial KPIs. We do regulate with financial KPIs. We do supervise with financial KPIs. Now we need to bring in sustainability with all the information that is required to steer. And those two things need to be integrated to have a sustainable steering of companies. We cannot expect that financial experts, people who have been doing all their career on financials, they all of a sudden get this part for free overnight. Cannot happen. We need to be clear that the data gathering, the platforms, the structuring of the information must be developed. And actually, sector players need to come together to do this. This is why these net zero alliances exist. And then also cross sectors, there need to be work. And then there need to be initiatives, as we have heard from Ms. Berthier and also from Mr. Hans. There need to be, if I may call it that way, non-governmental organizations who clearly set these ambitions and come in as discussion partners. It's very important. And again, I can invite you, look into what the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance has done in terms of bringing NGOs in to exactly have this ambitious discussion and learn.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Tellinger, for participating in this session, for answering the question in the last minutes.
Thank you.
So if you leave, goodbye and see you later. So I'll go now into the other questions, but first I wanted to put a question myself on the table, because as always with new directives, it's about ambition. Some say it's very ambitious, others say it's not ambitious enough. Both are right, as always, in a way. But how, and without intervening into the trialogue discussion, etc., how has the reception been until now with the member states? Are the member states ready for this system? How are they being prepared? Mr. Dionisi, you said it will take 3 to 5 years. From Ms. Berthier, I heard from you, I think, that already in France, or somebody said already in France, there's a law which is comparable, but which is not sufficient because too vague, too open. So how will what is your prediction? How will be the reception in the member states, and what will be the implementation challenge? Can you comment on this?
Well, there are a number of member states, I mean, not many. There are a handful of member states who have already regulated on due diligence. So it's there's France, there's Germany as well, or we're planning to do it, like the Netherlands. But of course, as you suggested, the situation is different in different member states, and we have seen, let's say, what the process in the council, which has been, let's say, quite complex negotiation in the council. We have actually seen even in the parliament that the negotiations between the different groups have been quite complicated, and there were many committees involved, so 9 committees in total in parliament, simply because this is an initiative that touches upon almost everything. So that's why all kinds of stakeholders are concerned, and it's normal that some would want more ambitious, and some would want maybe some specific accommodations for their sector, and so on. So the important, though, is with policy making at EU level, is to bring everyone on board in the end, because whatever will be adopted will have to be implemented in all the member states across the EU and through the global value chains of the companies active in the EU market, so not only the EU companies. So therefore, it's I would say it's important to have balance in the sense of on the one hand, you can be the absolute champion in a certain area, but fail to really get traction with the others, and bring a critical mass to have the transformation. So this is why we're going through this process of negotiations and eventually the result should be something that is enforceable, as was mentioned, is provides certainty, but it's also is transformative and consistent with the objectives that we have set for ourselves. And I take maybe just a few seconds to answer quickly another question that was put in the chat. Which was about the Parliament's position and what the Commission would do in the trilogues. So as I said, I would refrain from commenting, and of course we have our own internal political steering that will guide us in this trilogue. But as a principle. So what the Commission does in the trilogues is to try to facilitate convergence between the two co-legislators, the different aspects, while of course staying true to the objectives of the policy initiative. So this is basically our compass. It's I cannot say, you know, we like this more or that more, or okay, I could say, but it's not really the line that the Commission would take. We would try to facilitate convergence for the reasons that I mentioned. It's important to bring the different stakeholders and the member states on board. It's important as well to bring our international partners, and in particular like-minded ones, on board, because, you know, in particular when it comes to climate, it's a global stake. So but so we will follow the process with a view to facilitate convergence, but not with the price of abandoning the objectives that trigger this initiative. And the last comment I wanted to make is that let's not you know, leave this session with the impression that the CSDD is the only thing that the Commission is doing for the climate transition. So there is a very clear and strong commitment from this Commission on climate. You know, we mentioned the big Fit for 55 package. Now, this initiative is mainly about due diligence, as I said, in the aspects that were mentioned. But yeah, we should also see the overall picture and the efforts that are being made at the EU level to trigger the sustainability transition, or trigger and support and accelerate the sustainability transition. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this explanation of approach. But the question was also, would the Commission be open to supporting a more ambitious approach? I suppose in line with what
and I think I answered in the sense that you know, if this if we can facilitate convergence towards a more ambitious approach that you know, is in line with the policy objectives, of course, we would be happy to do that.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Berthier, the same topic, Article 15, the amendments by the Parliament. How do you view these?
If I may just also to kind of reply to the question you asked, just in a few words. I just want, I mean, we've seen in the general approach of the Council, I think that they had taken out financial institutions. And if I remember correctly, the link with the director's remuneration. So we see the inclination of some member states that are not really welcoming that initiative. And that's really, really worrying. That shows that the member states do not play the game and actually do not actually follow up on their commitment to address the climate and the biodiversity crisis. But I'd like to add that with the IPCC recommendations that are unambiguous, they're really clear. Private sector needs to address their climate contribution now. The European Commission with the European Green Deal has committed and has itself to ensure climate neutrality by 2050. Therefore, we need, and it's more than we need, the European Commission need to stand strong on this. We are aware that there are other measures that are often as well not ambitious enough as well. So yes, there are other measures. Yes, there is the Fit for 55, but it's all overall going too slow and it's overall not ambitious enough. And it's better, of course, and we welcome the European Green Deal that had never happened before. That's the first time the environment was put so high in the political agenda. Yet, if the European Commission is to deliver on its commitment to ensure the Union's transition to a climate neutral economy by 2050, it needs to stand strong and it needs to include climate in the CSDDD, because that's really, really important. And as it's been said before, it has the potential to be a game changer. On the question about the European Parliament's position, Well, we welcome it. It's way better in a way that on that front than the Commission's proposal, because it has included climate and the Paris Agreement. The ENVI committee's position is better than the jury's committee's position, because it's clearer, and the definition of the adverse environmental impact is way better. Even from a purely legal point of view, the ENVI committee's position makes sense. The jury's changes will need to be rectified because it simply doesn't really make sense from a legal point of view, the way they've drafted it, because they've included the same list of adverse environmental impact than jury, which is a good proposal, which is actually aligned to CSRD, which was inspired by the taxonomy regulation, but they put it into the annex without referring to it in the definition. So that needs to be remedied. They've also improved the Article 15 on the climate transition plan, but we still prefer the ENVI committee's position. They also re-included the financial institutions, which actually the council would really like to see leave, and France, I think, including France. So yeah, it's not perfect, but it's an improvement.
Mm-hmm. I want to, before jumping to the questions that have been asked to Mr. Hans, I want to point to the last question, which is also in a way on the problem of inertia, because we're talking about speed versus inertia, how to manage this. And it's about the question is, doesn't it already exist? Doesn't it already form part of companies' legal obligations under the duty of care? And as was the case in the Dutch Shell case, where the company was ordered to reduce all emissions by 45% by the end of 2030, etc., etc. So isn't it an already existing thing? And is this directive not simply creating the legal certainty across the union? Does someone want to comment on this? No, then it's a comment. Well, Mr. Hans, I have one question for you and then another one in reserve. One is about the report. How about companies with their headquarters outside the EU but operating within the EU? How do they perform? And that's of course interesting because it's a level playing field at a global level that's at stake here. The floor is yours.
Thanks, a very interesting question. There's no, we don't really see a difference. I think that is the question in short. So perhaps just to re-emphasize also what our analyses do, right? We looked at like multinational companies, and the biggest basically in the respective sectors. And there we would not really see a significant difference between EU headquartered ones or ones that are headquartered in the US or Taiwan or other countries. Just to say, right, we have not assessed, let's say, the 1,000 biggest or 2,000 biggest. So perhaps the picture might look different then, right? But just in that regard, just perhaps one additional note, for instance, we applied a similar methodology to a subset of Dutch companies last year, 21 Dutch companies. And also there we got a very mixed picture, basically reflecting also the findings of this sort of more international sample. So I think one cannot conclude that EU companies at the moment do better than sort of at this level than their counterparts in the US or somewhere else.
Thank you. So the reserve question, I see it popping up here and someone is sending it to me. What kind of external review could we consider to make sure companies making net zero pledges comply with the good practices posted in the CCRM? Can you handle this?
Sure. Perhaps just like to understand your question, what sort of review do you mean in terms of sort of review by research institutions like ours?
External or auditing?
Auditing. Yeah, exactly. I think that is a really important and an important question, because, for instance, what I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, right? For us to assess a single company at the moment takes about 8 to 10 analyst days, which is a lot of time to really understand the entire range of different commitments made, the reporting across different documents, annual reports, sustainability reports, press releases, etc., PP. And this mainly also relates to the fact that indeed, particularly when comparing it to financial disclosure, right, there are no harmonized guidelines at the moment. So there are as many different approaches out there, it feels, as there are companies. And it's very difficult to sort of piece these together. And I would even argue then impossible at times for consumers or regulators to really do that and understand that, right? So to have the regulation, and I think that's why we are so strongly emphasizing the need for regulation and not just voluntary initiatives where perhaps also companies have a say on how certain things are being set up or designed, but really having mandatory regulation is a first a must to have, because only then you also can have the independent auditing and also us researchers, for instance, to compare against, right, and have a standard, a regulation where we also can become more active. Because as I said, at the moment to do that, it's first of all very time intense, and we can do it for a very small subsample, but there is not an organization that can do that for hundreds or even thousands of companies.
As you mentioned the word, and then I come back to the other questions that pop off. You mentioned the word regulation. I haven't read the explanation on this, but why is it a directive, Mr. Dionisi, and not a regulation? Because then you would have a general guarantee immediately.
Yes. Well, there is there is a very short answer to this. It's linked to the legal base that we've been using, basically. So, in the area of company law, the EU proceeds through directives, and because this is the mandate that it has, and it's in view of the different legal traditions in different member states. So this is what, this is the instrument that we have, basically. There's also a related question that is sometimes raised, because directives can be maximum harmonization or minimum harmonization. And why do we go for minimum harmonization? And this is more, in line with the philosophy of the initiative, because it would be a bit strange to kind of put a cap on how far individual member states can go in supporting the sustainability transition. So the way it is now in the proposal, it's a minimum harmonization, which means that the member states can go beyond. Can extend the scope, can enlarge the ambition, and so on. Of course, this will be part of their transposition after the directive is adopted. But so these are 2 points that have often been raised in the political discussions. And why not a regulation? And if a directive, why not maximum harmonization?
Okay, thank you. So now we have 2 questions left because one has been managed already. One is from Patrick Klaarhout. To what extent is the CSDR directive consistent with the CSDR directive?
I think it's, it's certainly misspelled. Maybe it refers to what extent or what's the interplay between the CSDD that we've been discussing and the CSRD, which is the Sustainability Reporting Directive. And the simple answer to this is that the CSDD is not about reporting, is about the behavior. So we consider that the reporting side is by and large covered by the CSRD. This directive, this proposal, the CSDD, is about what actually the companies should do and things that they will report about under the CSRD provisions. But this is the simple answer, of course there are some footnotes to that, but I would keep it at that. This is not a reporting directive, and we consider that the reporting is largely covered by the other initiatives, CSRD.
Thank you. And then I see here a last question, but it's a question that comes back to everything. The level playing field, competitive advantages, which have been mentioned, and disadvantages, and the financial sector. I give you, the three speakers, I give you all the floor on this. And then if nothing else pops up, then this will be the discussion.
These are several questions. So on the financial sector, I have to say from the viewpoint of the Commission's proposal, it is essential to have it in. Why? Because the companies, the non-financial companies who are expected to undertake due diligence and to make all these improvements in their value chains, they also need funding. So leaving the financial sector off the hook basically, undercuts their access to funding. It's from our viewpoint, the financial sector should be in. It's quite essential for the overall impact of the proposal. On the competitive advantage, disadvantage, that's why it's important first to have a system that works and it's not leaky, because if you create something that places many requirements, but they can be bypassed, evaded, so you may have the opposite effect. So it's important to have a good system that is, let's say, enforceable, realistic, balanced. I also mentioned the importance of discussing, collaborating with the international partners, in particular, I would say, like-minded countries, but also, what we call the global south. It's very important to have them on board and to support them in implementing the requirements that will come from this directive. And in the end, one can even think of turning, sustainability, and this is what we hope to eventually obtain, to turning a commitment to sustainability into a competitive advantage. So there are studies that show actually that companies that are taking sustainability into account and are committed to this, they tend to have a better financial performance as well. So if the incentives are right, we actually think that it could be an advantage eventually. But of course, as I mentioned, it's you cannot have a leaky system for that. You cannot leave the financing outside. You cannot have requirements that are not properly enforced or properly monitored, because then it defeats the purpose.
Yes, better a robust system, which is a bit less ambitious in the first phase, etc. So, Ms. Berthier, have you final comments on these keywords: competitive advantages, disadvantages, level playing field, finance sector? In a way, you answered them already, but if you have final comments, please go ahead.
Sure. On the financial institution, it's essential that the financial sector is included in the directive. If you think about it, there is actually no justifiable reason why it shouldn't be, given the impact actually that sector has on the environment and human rights. And so left unchecked, actually the impacts could also and would be detrimental for the financial sector itself, for the financial institutions themselves, but also would threaten the wider economic and planetary stability. So it's really important that these financial stakeholders actually have to do their own due diligence to understand and to identify the impacts they have on the environment and on climate and on human rights, and to ensure that actually financial flows are channeled in the right direction. And to do that, we need them to do due diligence. I'd also like to take the opportunity maybe to reply to the question that was asked before and nobody reply to. If I understood the question correctly, yes, climate litigation is on the rise. It's not going to change, I think. It's only going to increase for a good reason, because until the private sector doesn't play the game and doesn't actually address the impact they have on climate, there will be part of civil society to go to court and to challenge the actually unlawful conduct they are having. Part of them, not all of them, of course, fortunately. And that part of civil society are already relying on legal tools that, of course, already exist in waiting for the adoption of the Due Diligence Directive. And so in a certain way, yes, that directive will actually bring more legal certainty, but also more legal clarity for companies to understand better what their obligations are, but also to have a better visibility in relation to the risks that they have to deal with, including litigation risk. And so the clearer the legal framework is, actually the better it is for the private sector as well to identify the risk that they need to face in a more specific way. So yes, more clarity and more accountability.
Thank you. That's a very interesting way of putting it together. Mr. Hans, final comments?
Actually, not on this one. There's also even one additional question in the chat. Perhaps shall we go to this one then?
So we continue, but I'll tell something about it. Yes, about oncoming questions. You have no question. You have no comments on this.
No, exactly. I think I would.
To respect the time frame, I would propose to close the meeting. If there are more questions, you can bring them in. We'll try and answer them or distribute them and organize something sensible about it. We will take it up anyway. So before closing the session, I would like to mention a webinar on the 10th of May, within exactly a week, on the Capital Requirement Directive. And I want to mention the seminar in Brussels on the 23rd of May by our colleagues of the Federal Council on how to become sustainable, new perspectives for the transition of corporate and financial actors. Very interesting. I would like to thank the speakers, Dan Dionisi, Anaïs Berthier, Gunther Talinger, who left us already, and Frédéric Hans. And I also want to thank Nathalie Bouquet of our Belgian Federal Council colleagues, with whom we cooperate and who prepared this session, and also Fee Kirsch and Sibren for the technical assistance. And I would like to thank you all for listening and participating. I hope we helped the process of this directive a step further in the right direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.